today. I'm delighted to introduce our sabbatical visitor, or someone who's visiting on his sabbatical, the department, Torkild Lyngstad. Torkild is a professor of sociology at the University of Oslo from Norway, and he's already been here a few months, and I've really enjoyed the few months that I've already got to spend with him. And I pushed him to present early so that we could, he could present himself and everybody could benefit from him being here. Torkild is kind of a new generation, part of a new generation of Scandinavian social scientists who are pushing the forefront of research using register data, but using not local homegrown methods, but taking the best methods from around the world. So causal analysis, very careful analysis with data much better than anything we can get with samples. So this has already happened in the United States. The Scandinavian kind of pioneers, that disease has spread over here, and so more and more people are doing research with census research data centers, and many Americans are, especially in economics, this is like the new thing using administrative records. So we're just delighted to have Torkild here for this year because he's already an expert in this. So his early work was, I believe his dissertation was on divorce and various determinants of divorce that had never been possible to look at before. I met him for the first time in Vienna, where he was working on how a very difficult to analyze problem of how the fertility of one sibling affects the fertility of another sibling. Okay, so you can imagine how could you possibly figure that out, but Torkild did. He first got interested in demography. I found this out over lunch when he was working on doing forensic demography of war crimes in the result of the war in Yugoslavia. So that's one of his early investigations. So now he's working on many things. I've already heard about a couple of them. One is GWAS, which we, I think, heard about last week. Last week's talk was questions about GWAS with Ken. So he's working on GWAS and what's the outcome? Education?
Well, so far only twin data, but in the future also GWAS data and education.
Education.
But also other types of things.
Yeah, so that's what he's just getting started with. And today he's going to talk about residential segregation in Norway and the white flight of Norwegians, or I'm calling it like Norwegian flight from refugees. But I urge you to take advantage of Torkild's presence here, not just for his expertise with his register type data, but also just as a methodologist. He's a really fantastic methodologist, and I'm sure you could have a good conversation with him about whatever you're doing. So with that long enough introduction, and taking away Torkild's time, welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you for this. Something we started with. We submit next abstract to PA within the deadline, barely, and we hope to do some more with the future. So it's a little early, which I thought was good for a round so you can skewer us and find out what we're doing wrong. I work with a number of other people. Are Skei Hermansen is the kind of brain behind this, and then Adrian Rogne has done all the work. He's the RA. And then the analysis. Gunn Birkelund got the funding for the project. Torbjørn Skardahl knows how to make maps. And what is my role? I'm the free rider. All big projects have a free rider, and I'm the free rider. And it's about ethnic neighborhood segregation, residential mobility dynamics. But since, even though there are multiple Norwegian speakers in the room, I'm counting at least 3. I was hoping for 4, but I think it's only 3. I think we need some necessary contextual material about Norway to understand what we're talking about when we are going to talk about this analysis of ethnic segregation and residential mobility in the Oslo metro area. So where are we anyway? I realize colors doesn't look perfect it's perfect on my laptop, but we're over here. It's like a green dot over there. Norway is a little bit smaller than Minnesota in population, a little smaller than California in land area, so it's a sparsely populated country. And to understand where Norway is today, I think we have to take a step back and look at this, my favorite figure in the world, is folkemengdens bevegelse, a graph that's been produced for many, many years by Statistics Norway that shows the crude rates of births in red and mortality in blue, out-migration in light blue, and immigration in brownish. And it shows the path Norway has taken from through the demographic transition and into modernity. You see the demographic crisis here. You see the large natural increase. You see the Spanish flu in 1918. And the corresponding baby boom 2 years later. The baby boom after World War II, after a dip in fertility. And see the decline towards below replacement and even lower fertility that we have today. You see the big three waves of Norwegian emigration to North America. Norway is second only to Ireland in relative rates of migration to the New World. And you see the start of the modern immigration area with high and increasing rates of in-migration. There's of course also out-migration in this period, but there's a gap. And this gap results in this, the increase of immigrants in the Norwegian population that used to be, decades ago, very, very homogeneous. And now it's becoming rapidly a multicultural society, a multicultural, multi-ethnic population. So this is new to Norway and Norwegian institutions and Norwegian society at large. Probably some of the things I would say will feel a little bit weird in the US, where this history is small. These topics are something you've thought of and worked for a long time. So now we have about 900,000 immigrants or children of immigrants living in Norway. And a large proportion of these come from countries quite far away. Historically, most of the migration been from other Nordic countries and other close European countries like the UK or Germany. But now we have a lot of migrants from really all parts of the world. Some of the biggest countries are still European countries. Poland, Lithuania, Sweden. These numbers are a little outdated, a few years old, but still shows the larger picture. But then you see Somalia, so a larger population, Pakistanis, Iraqis, Vietnamese, Philippines, Iranians, Turkish, and so on. So there are many countries that are send migrants to the United States, to Norway. So where does all this take us? Well, Norway is also a Scandinavian welfare state, where social institutions modify risks and rewards. We have compressed wealth and income distribution. We have free public education and healthcare. There's a wide range of various benefits. Parental leave is one of them. I benefited from myself recently. We have strong labor unions, relatively speaking, and a centralized wage bargaining system. And when immigrants meet the welfare state, they tend to have lower employment and higher benefits received. I should mention that I met one of my collaborators on this larger research project. This is from Bernd. He's here and randomly on the street earlier this morning and invited him to come. And he's one of the leading experts on the economic integration of migrants in Norwegian society. So I'm really tacitly referencing Bernd. But they also have better opportunities. Social structure also means that we have better opportunities for relatively poor, disadvantaged immigrant children. And what are the consequences of this immigration for mobility and segregation patterns? Well, if you look at the public discourse, you see much of this similar expressions as you have in many other European countries. There's worries about ghettos, of concentration of poorly integrated immigrants in all neighborhoods where they avoid contact with the native population, don't blend in. There is fear of rise of so-called parallel societies where norms and the norms and the rules of the majority population is replaced by a different set of standards. So the discourse, I think, is a little bit it's a little bit friendlier, a little bit more less inflammatory than in many other European countries, but still it's a big topic and it's a big flashpoint in public debate. So where does our question come in? Basically what we wonder is how majority and minority populations react to changes in the ethnic composition of their neighborhoods. And our modest contribution to this huge, shall I say, literature on white flight or native flight, as is the typical terms for this behavior, is our relatively good data. It allows us for estimating richer models for individuals and for communities. And maybe also a context where many of these sources of residential segregation, should be less important.
What does this third point mean?
I'm thinking of that an immigrant neighborhood is not necessarily dirt poor in Norway. There's less socioeconomic differences. There's still some, of course, but there's certainly less if compared to the some of the suburbs of Paris, for example, can be often. We don't have this dramatic differences in Norway, I would say, even though the differences are there. So we could at least rule out some of the factors that shape residential segregation. And what we'll be looking at is native outmobilities, where the probability of outmigration among natives should be positively associated with the proportion of non-Western immigrants in the neighborhood, and more so than the similar corresponding probability among immigrants, non-Western immigrants, I'd say. And native flight, where we try to isolate sort of the behavior of moving not only out of the neighborhood as in response to an increase of non-Western immigrants in the local population, but also tracking these people to a neighborhood with a lower corresponding proportion. And we'll also be looking at native avoidance, where natives' share of in-movers to a neighborhood is negatively associated with the proportion of residents who are non-Western migrants.
Can you just distinguish between 1 and 2?
So the first, the outmobility means that you leave the neighborhood, and the likelihood of leaving is a model as a response to changes in the share of non-Western immigrants. But flight means that you not only leave the neighborhood, you leave the neighborhood for another neighborhood with a lower proportion. So we should care about not only your origin but also your destination. And we have a very simplistic theory about how the segregation process goes on. Our starting point, as most studies in this literature, is the Thomas Schelling segregation model, where the world is a chessboard and black and white pieces sort into groups on that chessboard. And the takeaway from that model, in my view, is that even weak own group preference produces relatively strong segregation around tipping points where the local population reaches a certain representation of the out group, then you will move out. And so even if you don't have to have a very strong preference for living with people, individuals of your own within your own group, for fairly segregated macro level patterns to emerge. In Europe, it's at least our view, that non-Western immigrants are typically seen as the out group. I mean, immigrants from Asia, Turkey, Africa. And often the Norwegian-born children would be included in our case, Norwegian-born children would be included in that out group to some extent. An interesting observation, I think, is that no European migration research really studies race. Instead, they use many other locutions for race, ethnicity, or visible minorities, which is obviously alludes to skin tone differences or headscarves on Muslim women or similar things. But they avoid the word race. So we're going with that. We're talking about non-Western immigrants. mobility decision making is not only shaped by preference for neighbors, neighborhoods differ in many other respects. The age structure, housing stock, and financial resources of individuals who live there and of those who decide to move in and so on. And another piece of sort of ideas that we take with us is what's called the proxy hypothesis for immigrant concentrations. It basically says that immigrant concentrations function as an inverse proxy for neighborhood quality. So the higher share of immigrants in the neighborhood, the more will the natives, the less will the natives value the quality of that neighborhood. And outmigration then happens in a response to a fear of neighborhood decline as the share of immigrants increase.
Torkild? The fear of neighborhood decline, does that include a fear of decline in the value of a house? That's a big factor
yes.
in the U.S.
I mean,
it's said to be.
In the papers I read recently on, they do think this, but it's not very well laid out in the papers I read Ingrid Gould Ellen, if you know the name, is a European migration researcher who's been writing about this. And it's not really specified exactly what aspects of neighborhood quality, but I guess this is a large bag type of concept that would include worries about including worries about future house prices, future qualities of schools, future all kinds of public investments. So it's not very well specified. I'll return to that. And then one another point that's been raised in this literature is the potential important role of parents and parents of young children, preschoolers for example, who could be more sensitive to neighborhood composition than other groups. Because they are heavy users of public services, schools and preschools, and may display a different type of behavior in response to changes in their environment. So here are some papers from the literature that's fairly recent. As you see, there are some Norwegian studies. There's Rattelå and Safi from studies from Paris metro area, a wonderful study where they're able to control for also unobserved factors at the neighborhood level. There's Kai Crowder's work that I'm sure you're aware of, and Macaway also studies Paris. Vesterland Norvik is the only Norwegian study so far, and they only study outmobility of the neighborhood. There's also a Swedish study that's fairly recent on this topic. So even though these studies have covered a lot of ground, we think we're still able to contribute to the literature given. You can cover several of these, all these three aspects, and we have, I think, many of them superior data that allows us to estimate richer models than many of the earlier studies have been able to. And our geographical focus is the Oslo metro area, more or less. We've created a catchment area loosely based on commuting distances. And these are municipality borders, so here's Oslo municipality. And around here we have a neighboring municipality that has a lot of commuters that come that travels within this area. There's a lot of contact across borders also. So this is the relevant area. We have information on the whole country, and we're going to use that to calculate a proportion of non-Western immigrants in destination areas for our estimates of flight. But the moves we're looking at all take place in this area, or from or within this area. So our data, as Josh talked about, is we are avid users of registry data.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
How large? What are the dimensions of the box that you had in the?
In square kilometers.
Yeah. Do you know what the north-south kilometer distance is in the east-west?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But this is like 50 kilometers high, 20
no,
kilometers wide?
yeah, maybe. I what you say about?
You got the minutes. So
you got the minutes, you can calculate
the picture. Can you guys just complete this? Isn't it like 1 mile per minute or something? No. Sorry.
So it should also be noted that much larger these areas here, you go into rural areas and parts of those municipalities, also forests, and you see that the population counts for some of these areas are low, very low. So most of the population lives around this fjord and into some of the valleys around it. So this is, my guess is that this area is I'm not going to make a guess. But it's commuting distances is a good proxy perhaps. So you within this area you can move within an hour, right? So at least from the center. So if you go from here to there, maybe it will take you a little longer. But certainly you can commute to most commutes would be within 1 hour or less.
Okay.
That's okay to say, right? Yeah.
It will take you a day to run from one end to the other.
Yeah, for you, not for me. So we have a large database that covers all Norwegian individuals, all individuals ever resident in Norway from 1960 to today. So anyone residing permanently in Norway is assigned an ID number that follows you in all interactions with your government. So whenever you have a child, it's registered with your ID number and the child's new ID number and the other co-parents' ID number. And when you pay your tax, your tax return is registered on the ID number, so all kinds of income you have and wealth and education the same way, including achievements such as grades and test scores are registered on your ID. And this, not only do you have lots of rich information on individuals, but you also have links between these individuals. Parents and children, as I said, but also individuals and institutions such as workplaces or schools. We're not using the breadth of this data, but we're using the very detailed residential data that we have, which links people to neighborhoods in this catchment area. I'm going to show you the neighborhoods in a minute. So we're delineating this data, looking at adults in the sort of prime working age, 25 to 65 years old, from 1993 to 2013. And we're throwing out person years outside the area or outside this age band. We're also throwing out, not counting international immigrations. Once you left the country, you're out of the analysis. Once you come into the country, you can be counted, but the immigration itself is not counted. This leaves us with about 10 million person years for 1 million individuals, distributed over about 1,500 neighborhoods.
So all these neighborhoods are within this area?
Yes, I'm going to show you a new map with that. And here they are. So here can you see detailed neighborhood borders, and in here it's impossible to distinguish them from each other because they're so small. And these units, I think we could say are comparable to US census tracts, although population counts will probably be a little bit smaller. And you see their geographical size increase as you move away from the center. That's because population counts are lower and lower, and there's basically not, there's no need to split them up. They're designed to be relatively stable over time. That's why we have the same codes for this period. And if there's a merging of municipalities or other border changes, these borders are typically attempted preserved over this period. And here's the population. As you can see, the population in this area is, the colors doesn't show very well on where I stand, but hopefully better for you. There are lighter colors around the fjord here, and into these valleys. And that's basically the main city built-up areas in Oslo. You see there are some white spots. That's because there's no one living in that area. This is a big forest areas. There's some water, bodies of water also, and there's some areas that inside the city that are more industrial, where no one has their actual address.
How do you deal with second homes, which I think there are a lot on the fjord?
Yeah, sure. All the regions have this summer house somewhere, right? But you have to be registered at an address, and we use your registered address to place you in your neighborhood. So second homes is nice to have. I know, but it's not something that's a problem for our analysis, unless of course you flee to the second home on the coast whenever. Yeah. We can't get into that. And even though we have very detailed data on country of origin, we're collapsing, for this simple analysis, collapsing people into 6 categories. We distinguish between natives, immigrants, and their descendants. And we distinguish between people who have arrived in Norway from a Western background, so EU, EFTA, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and non-Western background are all other countries.
What's the frequency of intermarriage or mixed marriages?
Mixed marriages. It's relatively low. There's of course quite a bit of Norwegian Western couples. So people who meet their spouse in studying or at work or wherever. So there's quite a bit of this, but with the non-Western backgrounds, there's relatively few.
Okay, so you exclude them from because they don't belong to any of these categories.
No, we're basing this information on individuals. So if you're a French woman moving to Norway, you would be characterized as a Western immigrant, regardless of who you're married to.
Okay, but if you're a descendant of immigrants born
So if you're born in Norway to 2 foreign-born parents, you will be a descendant of immigrants. But we have a category for others that pick up these French-Norwegian kids, and also the kids born abroad to Norwegian parents, which also happens.
Or to one Norwegian and one foreign.
Huh? Oh my God. Okay, so this just shows 4 time points in our data. That's also difficult to see for you, I think. But if you see carefully here, you see that's just a green blob that grows in size in the inner city and out over time into the Groruddalen here, which is a center for migrant settlement, and further south from the central Oslo. So I'm going to skip this. So let's go to the analysis. Let's look at results for out mobility. Are Norwegians moving out of their neighborhoods in response to increasing shares of immigrants in their local communities? We estimate linear probability models for this, and also for flight, native flight, with a moving defined as a new neighborhood ID change from January 1st, one year to January 1st year after. That means you moved within that year. And the interpretation in the graph I'm going to show you is the beta is the percentage point change in probability of moving by 1 percentage point change in the non-Western, the concentration of non-Western immigrants in the neighborhood. And we do a series of models where you add different sets of controls. We have calendar year, age dummies, controls for sex and SES, family characteristics, and then importantly neighborhood fixed effects, because we have enough power to include basically dummies for every individual neighborhood. We also add some time varying neighborhood characteristics, because neighborhood fixed effects are only going to pick up the stable characteristics of each neighborhood. And we also add time varying neighborhood characteristics of the expanded neighborhood, so the neighbors of the neighborhoods around that neighborhood. Yes?
Oh, just a quick question. How do immigrants decide? I mean, does the government help them settle in different places, or do they get to pick wherever they want to go? Or?
Depends on how they come into the country. So refugees will be settled.
Okay.
There are a number of systems that help immigrants find housing. Typically, many of them will be living in social housing, so it's limitations on where they will stay. But otherwise, they were on the market as anyone else.
So the independent variable is proportion of NW immigrants, and so when you put in the neighborhood fixed effects, it's kind of people moving out of a particular neighborhood, and then you're seeing that vary the proportion.
So we have basically what identifies the parameter is the deviation from the overall trend for in the proportion of non-Western immigrants for that neighborhood. So it's a sharper increase in some and a slower or decrease in others, and that variation is what gives us the possibility to calculate the whole parameter. Then eventually we also have the model with individual fixed effects. First, this is a gross relationship. I think I'm just going to go straight to this. So here we have the first top model there is with no controls, and then we move down to a model with more and more controls. If you see there's a steady decline in the, if I go over here, here are the natives. And in the first unadjusted model, they have a more than a 0.3 percentage point increase for every to move out a year, for every percentage point increase in non-Western immigrants. So it's a rather large, strong response to changes in the environment. But this decreases over time, and you're left with about a 0.10 percentage point increase when you have included also the individual local fixed effects. Non-Western immigrants and their descendants, on the other hand, they have a tendency to not to move out, to stay in the neighborhood. So they, once their individuals from the same group become numerous in that area. So from this we could say at least that there's some tendency for native out mobility of neighborhood as a consequence of higher immigrant concentrations. Then for white flight, the situation is much more complicated because we have, since we have defined the dependent variable of flight as moving out to a neighborhood with a lower concentration share of non-Western immigrants, and we are focusing on the part of the country where most of the action is, most of the non-Western, more non-Western immigrants live, we're probably ending up with having these estimates being high, overestimating the tendency towards white flight or native flight. So if you focus on the natives again, there's a decline from the unadjusted model, but then an increase a little bit. I'm not sure exactly what to make of this increase yet, but if you just look at the models down to models with the neighborhood fixed effects and including time varying controls for neighborhoods, there's a not ignorable, sizable, I would say, 0.3 or 0.4 percentage point increase for every percentage point of non-Western immigrants in the neighborhood, of the likelihood of leaving your place of residence for a place that has a lower concentration.
So is the immigrant share is changing by 2, 3, 5, 10%, numbers like that?
Yeah, over this whole period it can go dramatically up because you have areas where they're concentrated, so where there's basically no one, and then there, over the 20-year period, there it's 70, 80.
70, 80%?
Yeah, over the whole period. From year to year, the change will be less, of course. So, but it varies tremendously between neighborhoods.
I'm trying to understand the M9 individual fixed effects and what those would mean. I suppose you would have to, it would be identified off of people who do this more than once in the observation?
It could also be that you stay in one place and then there's an increase in your if you live.
So just lower mobility in general could be what's.
I think we're overestimating the likelihood of leaving, and I wondered myself why I was wondering whether I should cut out those models. I wasn't sure I understood it. If you follow the same individual over these 20 years, there are two sources of variation for changes in X. There's population change, and as you move, right? You can also move. So if you move to anywhere, you're generating some of that change that identifies effect. So my wonder is, what's that really picking up? Is it picking up some kind of loop? I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm focusing on these models.
You could follow them up to their first move.
Yeah, something like this. I could possibly sensor them. Okay. So then we also do this avoidance analysis where we look who moves into a neighborhood with higher proportions of non-Western immigrants. And that's at the neighborhood year level. So you calculate the proportion of in-movers, the proportion of natives among the in-movers in any given year for any given neighborhood. And we estimate a set of models where we look where we use the proportion of in-movers as the outcome, and the proportion of non-Western residents the year before as the explanatory variable. And if you look, we add controls, find also both neighborhood fixed effects and time invariant neighborhood controls. And if you compare the first uncontrolled and the one with time varying neighborhood controls, you see that natives' share of all the in-movers into a given neighborhood is reduced by more than 1 percentage point for every percentage point of non-Western immigrants that are already residing in that area, in the area. Conversely, for non-Western immigrants, you see that they are increasing their share correspondingly, and that this difference, when you control for neighborhood fixed effects and time varying controls for neighborhood characteristics, is markedly diminished, but still is sizable. It's about half a percentage point that's left for the natives. And if you look at the last point of my sort of theory plan, look at the sensitivity, how the sensitivity to neighborhood composition varies with your family situation. I did a small sub-analysis of outmobility to look at this, and we estimated the same models with the interaction for children. And these bars show the response to a percentage point change in the proportion of non-Western immigrants for individuals who have parents, just are registered as parents, not necessarily living with them, but they're registered with a child that's of a certain age. And these are 0 to 2-year-olds, these are 3 to 5-year-olds, these are the preschool groups in Norway. That's the school start at 6, and here are the 6 to 8 and 9 to 11-year-olds. And so for natives, the sensitivity to changes in the neighborhood population composition is much higher than it was in the standard model. It's much higher for those with very young children. And conversely, for non-Western immigrants, they also have a higher sensitivity if they have small children, although for the difference is a little less dramatic. Descendants of non-Western immigrants are also a mixed bag, kind of, because they have displaced some of the characteristics of natives if they're just our children, and a little unclear result for the older child age groups. So what have we learned from all this? Certainly we learned that structural differences between groups explains away parts of this initial relationship. So there's a lot of difference between the immigrant and Norwegian populations that drive some of these patterns on the aggregate levels. But there's also a native out mobility in response to local shares of non-Western immigrants. And they also seem, although we're not entirely completely confident in these models, we seem to have also find evidence for native flight, that they're moving towards more native areas. And certainly we find some evidence for native avoidance, where they seem to avoid areas. So natives are markedly underrepresented among newcomers to neighborhoods with high proportions of non-Western immigrants. And as we saw, individuals with preschool children are much more sensitive than others. At least the natives are much more sensitive than others to these changes in the population composition. And what are the implications of this? Certainly, these often results of these kinds are thought of as evidence of racism or biases against specific groups. They are not. But there may be support for this hypothesis of out-group increase as a proxy for neighborhood decline. Particularly, we consider the differences by children's ages. And this, to me, surprises me a little bit, because Norway is a context where this fear of neighborhood decline and fear of your children's future should be a little bit less. The public schools are of reasonable quality. There's no major difference in what the state allots to each school. In fact, it could easily be given a lot more resources in immigrant-dense neighborhoods because of programs to remedy various social problems that may be documented. So maybe this hypothesis could need some more specificity, that it's not only fear of neighborhood decline that drives this process, but perhaps a fear of children's future learning, or language learning, for example, or more social cultural feeling of belonging. I thought I'd end with an anecdote, because a Norwegian colleague, Silje Fekjær, is a sociologist who did her PhD on consequences of school segregation for educational achievement, and basically her conclusion was that there was no major consequences of school segregation for educational achievement in Norwegian high schools. And following the Orlando Patterson test, that if you believe your results, you should live your results, so she moved to an immigrant-dense neighborhood in Oslo, in the Groruddalen, the Grorud Valley, and she felt lost in this area, and by the time her oldest son was about to start school, she moved to the other side of the city and found a home among her well-educated, middle-class, white, native-born friends. So, that's all. I have some limitations, but I'm sure you've already seen them. To just briefly go through this, the native flight results may be a kind of regression to the mean, because you count moves into the catchment area, but not out of the catchment area, but not into the catchment area. And since we focus on the part of the country where these proportions are higher, even random moves would probably show some kind of native flight. I guess we should also do a more detailed analysis of national origin groups, and we have the data to do it, so I think that would be a worthwhile avenue. And then it seems to me that we should also do more detailed analysis with family type and children. Okay, that's that. That'll be in the 20 minutes.
Okay. Would you like to call on people, or?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's start here, and then work my way. Okay.
You said in a previous slide that there is no evidence of bias from your study against immigrants, but how can you say that? That's not really what you're
I'm thinking the way that the behavioral data we have can be interpreted different ways. We don't have data on the actual intentions of moving, obviously. We don't have data on the research. So you can look at this different ways. So the anecdote of my colleague who didn't feel at home in her neighborhood doesn't mean, she shows a kind of preference for a certain type of neighborhood, but it's not evidence for racism, for example. Or maybe I'm just my haven't thought this through, but I'm just worried that whenever we present evidence of this, the results are blown out. So proportions
what
of
you
that.
mean it's not necessary?
Not necessarily, no. It could be, but
okay.
That all Norwegians are racist. I'm sure some are, but and maybe everyone are to a degree, but we don't necessarily know that from these numbers. And then there was behind here, then at the back.
Yeah. So I was just wondering about the housing market. Could the neighborhood fixed effects capture whether a neighborhood is actually less expensive to live in than another one, and that's driving somebody's decision to move somewhere else?
So the neighborhood fixed effect would take out sort of the average proportion of non-Western immigrants, right? So certainly in some neighborhoods there will be so the variation in house prices is as remarkable as most other places. The market is relatively free. There's some social housing that typically is concentrated in certain areas, and they tend to be immigrant dense. So to the extent that the housing market is the same over this period, we should be able to take out those differences with neighborhood fixed effects. But if there's a dramatic change in some neighborhoods' prices, and there could well be, and there's a lot of building going on, that also changes the character of some neighborhoods. So, but I can't see immediately some big threat to the interpretation of our results from that, but certainly that's a factor we need to consider when we write out this. Yeah. Then Bernd.
So I'd like to turn to that one result that you didn't want to present.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean that's a striking result, right?
Yeah.
So you get the coefficient on the immigrant share doubles pretty much when you control for individual fixed effects.
Yeah.
So at face value that says that you have a negative bias in the ODS or in the, that could be, right? Well, it could be that we all have unobserved propensities to move around, and that's negatively correlated with immigrant share in the neighborhood. So as such, that's like probably the one result that's.
So this the psychological trait openness to experience is unevenly distributed, and has those who live in neighborhoods with high proportion of non-Muslim immigrants tend to already have sorted themselves into neighborhoods with low such proportions. And when we control for individual fixed effects, we would take out those differences per the average person. Yeah, those one here.
Sure. Was it following up on the question about housing characteristics and whether or not they're fully captured in the neighborhood fixed effects? I think one thing that would be interesting to see is if the same patterns of moves exist during a time period during which the percentage of immigrants didn't really move. Maybe there's just a process where people start out in these neighborhoods, they have children, they have good income, savings, and then they trade up to the same other neighborhoods that they move to, so there's not really a change in the patterns of residential moves.
Our Grundkrets data, so the data for these neighborhoods, stops in 1990. But possibly could we, I mean, maybe we could do a similar analysis on a smaller city that has a period where you have this data, but where there's not much action until a little bit later in the period, perhaps. That'd be a possibility.
Yes. So I'm curious if your team has checked the robustness of these results using logistic regression instead of linear probability model, because I know that it seems like the probability of moving in any given period is probably going to be pretty small. I know that with linear probability models, you can get kind of wonky results if you have really small probabilities.
Absolutely. We haven't done anything like that yet. No sensitivity analysis of any kind. So, but that's something we will do for sure. Yes. Josh.
So it seems like what we typically want here is some exogenous change. Right? So I was thinking, how could you do that? It seems like you have people's exact addresses. So you could look maybe at whether an immigrant moves next door to you as opposed to farther away in the same district. And that's going to be, maybe it'll be correlated with what the value of your apartment is, and whether you're in a good building or not, but you have to have some variation that might help you. That was my first comment. And my second was, maybe you've already done this, but this looking at proportion of change in the neighborhood is mixing two things. One is that new immigrants are arriving, which seems very much the story that you're telling. But the other is that your friends and neighbors just moved to Orinda, and they're telling you how awesome Orinda is and showing you pictures, and so you know more people who've left. And you could, I think you could separate those two. I'm not sure how, but it seems like those are two different stories that, given your data, you could separate.
You can sort of calculate the proportion of natives moving out, or from one year to another, we calculate the proportion of immigrants arriving.
You're suggesting that the out-migration of natives is causing the in-migration?
Oh, well, this is a net. Your thing is kind of net migration, and it could be the in-migration of other people, or it could be the out-migration of your people.
Yeah, sure.
And those are two different stories. Again, I don't know you.
That's an important point. And the data should allow us to do something with this for sure. For sure, it does allow us to do something along the lines of your first comment, because in addition to this Grundkrets-setup, we also have 100 times 100 meter grid sets for a period for like the last 15 years or so. So we have your exact address down to the resolution of 100 meters. So we can see if you live in an apartment block that's 100 meters wide, deep, whatever, you have the same. You know that you have the same. You will have the same grid cell coordinates. So then you could look at this more detail. It will involve a completely different analysis, but that's possible. It's possible. Also, one other source of exogenous variation that's been used is settlement policy of refugees. So there are many different immigrants. Most immigrants are not refugees, but some are, and the refugees are settled into municipalities and areas by the government. So there's some kind of variation there that may be more like exogenous variation that you could possibly exploit.
Why only possibly? That sounds like
obviously.
Kind of low-hanging.
Obviously.
You a bit later than this, you had a bar graph showing the coefficients.
Sure.
Could you put that one?
Sure.
Yeah. So I had two thoughts there. One, first of all, the effect of children by age. To some degree, it might not be about concerns about quality of schools or something, which you discussed, but I think parents, once kids have started in school, then it becomes more costly to move. So there could just be a kind of very neutral.
Basically, you could think that these people here, they're behaving as usual, so as they want, but these people here, they're holding back, they're moving even if they want to, because their kids already in school integrated as classmates.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And then the coefficients for non-Western immigrants, did you discuss them and I missed them? Or did you not talk about them?
They go in the opposite direction. So
so they seem to say that the non-Western immigrants have a preference for living where there are more others, something like that. And that might be worth exploring further.
Picking up on one's first comment, it could also be the opposite, that when people have kids, they need to move because they were living as a couple in a one bedroom and they're looking for a larger place. That's when they commit to moving.
So it's a higher, you think about a higher general propensity to move.
Right.
But then, but that doesn't sort of play into why they should be more sensitive, because this is the interaction effect, so this is the higher sensitivity to non-Western immigrants. We've already taken out their higher propensity to move with dummies for those groups.
But if you're if your own family change is leading you to think about moving, then you've already absorbed the fixed costs of moving, and maybe now you think of a destination that will be non-immigrant.
We have to explore this more.
So I want to go back also on the issue of age, and you have 9 through 11, is that right, 9 through 11?
Yeah, 9.
But I'm kind of thinking from some other research I've read is that their parents might also think of moving when their kids are teenagers, and then they're more concerned about the environment and who they're hanging out with. And it does actually essentially double in the 9-11 from the previous age group, and I can only conjecture what it looks like in the 12 and 14-year-old group, but my guess is that it would increase even more.
And we have numbers for these groups. I didn't just want to cluster the graph because it would be too much. I want to focus on the first school part of it. But there's certainly other life course stages, and you also of course have the period when kids move out of the household typically also is also a kind of sensitive period for making decisions like this. Dennis?
Yeah, two quick thoughts. First, you could also just view from the cost perspective of moving. You might look at renters versus owners.
We don't have data on ownership. But I mean, we could in principle maybe use tax records to infer who owns buildings, but we don't have ownership per se.
Okay.
So if people are paying high capital, have high capital costs, so that basically interest on large mortgages, which would be an indicator of ownership. Recent ownership, not necessarily a mortgage. If you pay down a mortgage, you wouldn't pay it. And in wealth, but yeah. This is I've never used registered after that. People do this, but I'm not sure what you would pick up exactly. You pick up some homeowners, not all. Yeah.
And then just one other, I can't quite get my head around this, maybe I'm thinking about it wrong, but doesn't there have to be kind of a mechanical link between non-Western immigrants moving into a neighborhood and somebody moving out?
Yeah.
Because there's a slot. So is that accounted for here or something? I mean, I know there may be new construction, so I guess that's a bit different, but in other words, if a non-Western immigrant moves into my neighborhood, by definition somebody's moved out for that. So especially at the beginning of these flows, you mechanically expect some kind of linkage there, maybe.
Not necessarily, right? If people are bulking up more, so you could go the great, migration from South African Americans to Chicago. People aren't necessarily moving out. People just the neighborhoods are getting denser, and people are moving. So I don't know what the story is actually in Norway. Whether some of these situations are like people are moving out and other people moving in, or in some situations where people are moving in, where they're actually nobody moving. Less people moving out. People are just like getting into larger household sizes and like in the same space. Like. I mean, yeah, and that actually connects with my kind of concern, which is about, Norway has been a place where structural racism, racism really is about structure, right? Societies, and it's been very equal, and curious whether there's some way to use your analysis to look at, like, structural changes and kind of inequality, maybe pure, I don't know, maybe just purely by periods, to see whether, so I can imagine a time when, when everybody thinks, oh, all the schools are very much the same, right? Equal resources, maybe more resources to those who have higher needs. And then there comes a time when all of a sudden people think, you know what, even though there's more resources, these schools are not equal.
Sure.
And, they're connected with structural lack of opportunities.
This is not something we've thought much about yet, but certainly it's something to consider. Basically, there's probably possibilities to look at in more detail over time, as you suggest, and possibly also look more specifically at schools and school districts, which are not the same as these neighborhoods. So some school districts are whole different set of areas, and the school district changed a little bit over time. So I think there is some possibility of looking into this tipping point kind of mechanics that you alluded
to. Maybe this is a general point about fixed effects, but as I'm thinking again about the individual fixed effects, I'm thinking, yes, we could think of that fixed effect as telling us, well, is this a person who generally doesn't move much? But another way of thinking about it would be, oh, this is a person, as you stay in one place for longer and longer, more and more reasons to move accumulate. Your family changes, you get a different job, it's a longer commute or something. And so it could also be an indication that someone is getting more and more ready to move if they haven't been moving much. And then that could interact with this additional effect.
No, I'm not yet comfortable with this individual fixed rate models. The others I understand completely. This one I'm not sure I understand. So, at one level I did, but absolutely. So tenure in the place that basically you try to include something with tenure in the place where you've been. Yeah. So how many years since the last move or something? Yeah, that's possible.
All right, thank you so much.